Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to ZTV Live. I'm Susan Mulligan Fleischman. Today's Tuesday, June 1st. Happy new month to everybody. It's good to be back here again. It's been a while since I hosted the show, and I am thrilled to be back here again. And tonight, it's one of our favorite shows, Reading, Writing, and Ralph, with our literary editor, Ralph Peluso. Hey, Ralph, welcome back to ZTV.
Hi, Susan. How are you doing? We missed
I'm
you the
doing,
last few weeks.
yeah. Well, I know that Grace is more than capable and fills in for me
Well,
beautifully, but it's good to be back. It's been a while.
yeah, Grace did a very fine job. She's a great fill-in, a great host. And you had a birthday, so happy birthday. I hope it
Thank
was
you very much.
spectacular.
Yes, it was
Great.
spectacular as every 29th birthday is every year. No, just kidding.
Absolutely.
No, it was a good birthday. We've had a very busy May. I'm actually kind of thankful that May is done and June is here because I'm kind of ready to get back to normal a little bit.
I cannot believe it's June 1st. The year is almost halfway gone.
I know.
And I'm so happy that my segment of the show is filled out for the balance of the year, which is incredible.
Well,
Um,
you're a great host and a great show. Everybody loves to hear about books and stories, so you're a natural.
Thank you. It's hard to believe I was an accountant, but then I got a sense of humor. Um, the Tonight we have a terrific guest, Kelley Fanto Deetz, and she is an historian and an archaeologist.
Great.
And this will be. I know that sounds kind of archaic, but this is going to be one fun subject. So
Fantastic. Well,
everybody be on
let's
their
bring her
toes.
on. There she is. Hey,
Hi,
Kelley. Welcome to ZTV.
Hello.
hi, Kelley.
Thank
How
you for
are you?
having me on. I'm doing great. How are you all?
We're doing
We're,
fabulous.
we're
Good to
doing
see
great.
you.
I'm gonna let Ralph and you take it away, but I'll be here when you need me.
Thank you.
Awesome.
So Kelley, welcome. And I have to admit, I've had a few historians on, and now we have an archaeologist on, who's also a historian. And when I was in college, my history teacher or archaeology teacher were like 105 years old, could barely move. So how does somebody so young become an archaeologist? You have to explain that to me. Explain it to the audience.
Well, I guess first of all, I'm not quite 109, but I'm not as young as maybe you think I am. So there's that. But actually, I grew up in a family of archaeologists and historians. My father was an archaeologist and a historian, and I literally was steeped in it. My first job, if you will, was as a baby pilgrim at the Plymouth Plantation. My father was the director there in the
Wow.
1970s, and I was the ninth kid in the family, and they dressed me up like a pilgrim and paraded me around the site. So I've got a lot of years under my belt, even though I'm not 109 or 19, as you said your professors were.
So tell the audience about yourself, your background, where you grew up, um, how you ended up on the East Coast, and then how you were inspired to start the research about the evolution of American cuisine and the influence of the plantation cooks and slaves on our foods.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, I get it. I mentioned a moment ago that my father was an archaeologist and a historian who's a professor at UC Berkeley, where I grew up. I spent my childhood not just in museums, but also working in kitchens with my older siblings. And so I grew up both in the museum world, the history world, as well as in the culinary world. I found myself moving to Virginia at the age of 19. I attended the College of William and Mary, where I found a deep love of history, of colonial history in particular, of archaeology. I worked at Jamestown for a while when that site was sort of starting to gear up. And then I ended up majoring in African American studies and history at the College of William and Mary, which is the second oldest college in the country. And it was in that space that I found not just a love for sort of being the historical nerd that I've become, but of doing all the research, of really being diligent, of going into the archives, of touching papers that people haven't touched in, sometimes hundreds of years. And the archaeology as well is something really, I think, magical about digging something up that was thrown away so long ago, and you're the first person to touch it in hundreds of years. So it was kind of an emotional thing to sort of get into that. And when I found myself than going to UC Berkeley. So I went back to California. I got into the PhD program at UC Berkeley, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write my dissertation on. I knew that I was completely in love with the history of Virginia, the history of enslavement, telling the stories of those whose stories have not been told. And so I literally started looking at an 18th century newspaper online at Colonial Williamsburg because I love doing things like that. And I looked up for sale ads for enslaved folks. And I started reading through the 18th century Virginia Gazette, and I saw a ton of ads for enslaved cooks. And immediately, all of my training and, informal and formal and history, all of my background in working in kitchens culminated in a moment where I realized to myself, and after talking to a few people, that we actually don't, or at that point didn't know a lot about enslaved cooks. Images of Aunt Jemima and people like that sort of popped to the forefront. But the fact of the matter is we don't actually know what their lives were like. So I immediately had tons of questions about what their kitchen work was like, what food they brought with them in their minds and in their culture to the Americas. And that's where it all started.
Wow. And how did you end up at Stratton Hall?
Yeah, so I am the director of programming, education, and visitor engagement at Stratford Hall, and it's actually the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. So my background in all the things that I just said that I do, I've also been a professor on and off for the last decade. After Charlottesville happened, I had at that point already had done some consulting up there and given some lectures, etc. And the former CEO reached out and said, you know what, I think it's time that Stratford Hall start telling a broader story of all who lived here. Why don't you come up and work? And so it was a pretty easy and quick recruitment, and I fell in love with the site, and I haven't looked back.
Wow. And at Stratford Hall, you've got archaeologists and paleontologists. So how do the archaeologists and the paleontologists get along?
So, yeah, that's a whopping me and another person. So John Bachman is our paleo dude, for lack of a better phrase. He actually has a dinosaur named after him. I'm so jealous. Bachmani, I think it's called. So he is the paleontology guy. He leads the trips on the beach, and he knows more about dinosaurs and fossils than anybody I know. And then I'm an archaeologist working there, and right now we've got an incredible collection of archaeological artifacts that have been excavated over the last 30 years, and we get along great. He likes older things, and I like younger things. It's really that simple.
He likes dead older things.
Yeah, exactly. I like, dead younger things, like 300 years old or 200 years old. Just dropping zeros, that's all.
Well, that's going to take us to our first trivia question of the night. And it has to do with Stratford Hall, and which is on the shores of the Potomac. And they found a huge fossil there, the biggest fossil ever found at Stratton Shores. And it arguably belongs to the largest animal on the earth. So the question is, what is the largest animal on the earth? And there's two possible answers to this. So we'll have the audience. Remember, you can look it up on your smartphones. So the first person in with the correct answer will get an autographed copy of Bound to the Fire by Kelley Deetz. So anyway, so again, the biggest fossil ever found at Stratford Hall, it belongs arguably to the biggest animal on the planet. What is that animal? So tell us, so you mentioned Aunt Jemima, and then the other figure that comes to mind is Uncle Tom from the rice. How did they get so far skewed to these happy figures and smiling when their life on the plantation probably wasn't all that all the time?
Yeah, so that whole sort of propaganda campaign, if you will, was part of the sort of Southern sympathizer sort of movement, the anti-abolitionist movement that was coming as a response to the abolitionist rhetoric that was coming from the North and from overseas, sort of criticizing slavery. So let's be very clear, too, that from the moment that slavery really took hold, there were always people who were saying that it wasn't ethical and wasn't moral. So the idea that somehow only came about during the Civil War is just a flat-out falsehood. childhood. So if you think about the abolitionist literature that was really sort of shining a light onto the southern states mostly. And again, it wasn't just the South. There were enslaved folks in New Jersey in the middle of the Civil War. So we can't just demonize the southern states for being slaveholding communities. But it was a way in which the southern sort of elites were able to say, look, we're good to our slaves. They're happy here. It's Aunt so-and-so, it's Uncle so-and-so, and they're like family. And so that kind of rhetoric, while some of it, I think, was definitely rooted in some pretty close relationships that some of these folks actually had with the enslaved people that they kept in bondage on their plantations, was exaggerated and really used to promote the idea of the happy slave in the South. That got wed very quickly in the 19th century to minstrel shows, to advertising. And when you think about the Industrial Revolution, and all the ways in which things started, like food was mass produced, those images became very popular when talking about Southern foodways and, things like pancakes and rice. And rice, of course, was, is something we can talk about in a little bit, but rice came over from West Africa and was grown in the Georgia Sea Islands, et cetera, by people from the Senegambia region, from Senegal, the Mende folks. They all had long histories of rice cultivation in West Africa. So they were brought over specifically to grow rice in the Americas.
When you were doing your research, when did it first hit you that I've come across something, and this is how American food evolved? What was that like, and what was that moment?
Well, it's funny. So even before I started to do this research, when I first came to Virginia when I was 17 on a trip with my dad, I'd never been to the South, that I could remember. And I grew up in Oakland and Berkeley, California, and there were soul food restaurants everywhere, barbecue restaurants, etc. I knew what soul food was. When I came to the South and I went into restaurants that had all white staff, all white folks in there eating, and they're eating things that I considered soul food, I thought to myself, wait a second, for me, that food and an African-American identity was so intertwined, where when I came down South, I was like, wait a second, this is Southern food. This is American food. What's going on here? Fast forward into my research, and then I found myself reading these old cookbooks from the 18th and 19th century, and you literally start to see ingredients like okra, peanuts, right? All of these West African foods coming into the actual recipes. And that's something, as the picture that you see there, okra stew is something that was made across West and Central African communities in the kingdoms and the different cultures in West and Central Africa. Okra was brought over on the same ships that carried enslaved Africans and planted as crops here in the quote New World to cultivate the sort of Southern foodways. So everything, black-eyed peas. I mean, there's so many different food items and the ways in which it was cooked that are inherently African. And for me, it was reading those cookbooks, finding evidence of, a white lady on a plantation being like, wait a second, I love this gumbo. I'm going to write the recipe down so I can make sure my kids and their kids will also eat that. And that was, I think, one of the most exciting moments of my research.
Well, and we have a winner, which is great. So we'll see who it is in a second. But I'll set you up for the next phase of this. I've done a little research as a result of your book, and I'm finding there are more and more food historians, former chefs, that are now writing about soul food versus Southern food, and the connection. And I think one of them is Michael Twitty, and another is Adrian Miller, if they're familiar.
I know them both.
Good. I want to talk about their perspectives and your perspectives, how they're similar and how they're different. But let's check and see who the winner is on the first trivia question.
Yes, the winner is, let me scroll back up, Nancy Campbell Gorski won. She said blue whale, and at first I said keep guessing, but then I did look it up, and the blue whale is a member of the baleen whale family. So congratulations, Nancy.
Yeah, I remember I said there was two correct answers, and the second one is the blue whale.
Yeah,
yes. So it is the blue whale, and the baleen is, they're in the same family. Right. So congratulations, Campbell.
Way to go, Nancy. Thanks for playing. And Michelle, thank you for playing as well.
She's on her toes today. So let's get back to the other chefs that are now writing about soul food and the evolution of the American culinary diet and how its derivatives are from Africa. The two I mentioned, Michael Twitty and Adrian Miller. Where are you guys different? Where are you guys apart?
Yeah, so I think all three of us, and I know both of them, and they're wonderful people. They both, or all of us, all three of us want to tell these stories, want to really sort of set the record straight, if you will, really giving attribution to those who created this food, who cooked the food, who brought it to the Americas. I think we all came at it from a different angle, obviously. I'm a white woman. They're both African-American men. Michael Twitty, his book, The Cooking Gene, is very much about his ancestry, and so how that has both driven his own research and passion for this topic, as well as how it's driving him to sort of research his personal ancestry and what people in that tree and in those different cultures have sort of passed down even without him knowing. And then Adrian Miller was actually a lawyer for years, and so his background is a little bit more formal, less sort of artsy or chefy. Like Michael Twitty and I definitely have spent our time cooking professionally and for people. So I think there's a difference there. But, again, I think that the main thing is that we want these stories told, and we're all bringing our own particular, sort of professional training and personal reasons to the stories.
The one thing that got me is they both started using the term terenga, which you're probably familiar with, if I'm saying it correctly, which is kind of a pseudonym for Southern hospitality. It means all the same things. And, most of us who grew up from Western European cultures, the kitchen was the center, right? That's where everything happened. And so he says a lot of the Southern hospitality came from the terenga, which is, I guess, a Sudanese, if I remember correctly. And it meant warm imbuing and all of that. I got the impression that some of the child rearing on the plantations was left to those plantation cooks. What do you think?
So in terms of, there's two things that you just brought up. One is the sort of Southern hospitality. I'd love to sort of unpack that for a moment, and then we can sort of talk about the different roles that different enslaved people played on a plantation or were forced to play on a plantation. So the first thing is the Southern hospitality bit. If you think about, the classic sort of Gone with the Wind image, and most people can conjure those images of, Southern belles with big dresses and, African-American cooks. And this right here that you're seeing is an actual drawing of an enslaved cook in Amherst County from 1855. And so, you really sort of think about the dining room table, right? The ways in which these dinners and balls and Southern culture was so much sort of hinged on food and offering food to people. If you think about the pineapple as the universal symbol during the 18th century, and even now in some cases of hospitality, it is because pineapples were so rare that if you found yourself having one and you shared it, it was the ultimate symbol, ultimate gesture of hospitality. So eliteness, elite sort of Southernness and hospitality became very much sort of synonymous. You also had, a situation in the Southern colonies where you had these large plantation complexes with these gigantic homes. People would travel days or weeks sometimes to go visit, and you would be met with an entire staff of enslaved folks who were there at your beck and call. This was very much a product of the wealth of these Southern planter elites, as well as the size of these plantations and the ways in which these early colonists and later, sort of Virginians, et cetera, were really trying to establish themselves as something distinct. Now, you had mentioned as well the child rearing. On these larger plantations, if you were an enslaved chef, that was your job. I mean, you had a full staff underneath you, and that was what you were doing really, around the clock. I mean, the title of my book is Bound to the Fire because literally so many of these chefs couldn't leave the kitchen for the most part. I mean, sometimes they would go to market, they would go talk to the gardener, they would, sort of make the rounds, but they had to cook massive, dinners for these people. And they had to be cooked not just, in abundance, but also to perfection. a lot of the enslaved people that worked inside of the house, the domestic, the nursemaids, the nannies, etc., they would have had distinct roles in raising the children of the white family. And I mean, even down to nursing the babies. And that was very much common in these spaces.
I guess what I was thinking is where, if at all, did any of those blur together? Because kids have a tendency, as you know, to run throughout the entire house.
Yes.
So is it conceivable that they pick up some of the Southern hospitality Taranga characteristics in the interactions with those folks?
Absolutely. And there were several accounts that I read through all of my research where, a white person in the big house would be like, oh, the children are in the kitchen again. They're out there all night long hanging out with the cook. And so the kitchen really was in so many ways like it is now. If you think about it, the crossroads of multiple things, of culture, of people, of status, of young and old. And even, without exception, the plantation kitchen was the same thing. Of course, the status of enslavement made it very different. But in a space talking about culture and that kind of exposure, it was absolutely, I think of it as the core of the plantation. Absolutely.
Right. The heartbeat. The kitchen's always the heartbeat, right?
Yes, 100%.
So, I'm gonna cut to trivia question number two, and so we're gonna loop back to the Lee family, which were the residents of Stratford Hall. And so the question is, which King Street Tavern carries the nickname of a Lee family member? So give us the name of that family member. So which King Street Tavern in Old Town carries the nickname of one of the Lee family members? So first one in gets an autographed copy of Kelley Fanto Deetz's wonderful book, Bound to the Fire. So let's talk a little bit about some of the recipes. But before we get into that, which ones are your favorite? Which food would surprise most people to hear that it actually was from African origins?
I think peanuts. I know a lot of people know about George Washington Carver and peanut butter, but the story is far broader than that, right? That's kind of where the story of African descendant people and peanuts come to play, right? It's like, oh yeah, he invented peanut butter. Well, peanuts were actually called ground nuts or goobers. They were from West Africa. And if you travel around, and this isn't as true any much as it was even 20 years ago when I first came to Virginia. But places like, I don't even know if it's still open, but there's a restaurant in Surrey County. You go to these rural areas in Virginia, and peanut soup is one of those things. I mean, Virginia peanuts, everybody knows about Virginia peanuts. Those are African in origin, and things like peanut soup, you can literally trace those back directly to the different recipes directly to West and Central African communities. And so I think the peanut is definitely one of them. Black-eyed peas. I mean, I think there's nothing too shocking, but to me, whenever I bring up peanuts, I get a certain look like, really? Are you sure? Peanuts? But yes, peanuts.
Wow, that does surprise me. We have a winner already, which doesn't surprise me because most of the audience is in Alexandria, so they would absolutely know the answer to this question.
That's right. And the winner will not surprise you. She is our very own Out and About with Lucille O'Flaherty, chimed right in with the correct answer, which is Light Horse Harry Lee, and also gave us the name of the tavern, which is the Light Horse Tavern. Congratulations, Lucille. You get a copy of Kelley's book. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for playing.
Is Lucille spending a lot of time at Light Horse?
Maybe she is. I think she's laughing pretty well right now.
Hi, Lucille. Haven't seen Lucille in a while.
I know. I'm so glad that she's playing the game.
Yeah. Good. So let's talk about some of the recipes, some of the ones that have evolved and that stand out most to you.
Definitely. I can think of a couple right off the top of my head. One of them is gumbo, and gumbo is to New Orleans as, I don't know, peanut butter is to jelly. I mean, it just goes together, right? So Gumbo is actually, gumbo is another word for okra, and it's also a West African ingredient that came over. And the method of cooking and the ways in which you sort of combine a lot of different things in one pot is also very West African. And you see variants of gumbo throughout the southern United States. And I think that that's one of those dishes that transferred pretty cleanly in terms of replicating what they would have been eating in West Africa. The second would be jambalaya, which is a cousin or a descendant, I would say, of jollof rice, which is a national dish of many West and Central African, mostly West African countries. And it's literally, it's that sort of rice with spices and shrimp or chicken. It's, sausage, whatever kind of stuff you want to put in there. Well, if you look at jollof rice and jambalaya next to each other, it's pretty similar. So I think those two things are the big ones.
So some of the recipes that other recipes that come up in a way is one called family bread. So how does that different than plain old bread?
Said family bread? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Oh, maybe. Oh, yeah. I think it's family bread. Yeah.
Is it family bread? Okay. So somehow I'm not remembering the family part of the bread. But, I think a lot of things when you think about, soul food and the ways in which sort of, personal attachments are attached to recipes, I think that there's definitely a need to do that when you're passing things down through generations.
Yeah, I don't know. How about fish a la creme?
There you go. I had that and it was pretty decent. So that is not necessarily a West African recipe at all, but I put that in the book to really sort of highlight the kinds of things that these enslaved chefs had to cook. They were not just cooking one pot meals of gumbo. They were making French inspired, food. They had to make roux. They had to make a ton of stuff that was incredibly sophisticated and took a lot of training to make. So they were the top notch chefs of their era.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I want to talk about is some of the chefs you mentioned in your book, because I think it's kind of an homage to the past of these wonderful cooks that didn't get a whole lot of notoriety, of course. So talk about some of your favorite chefs and some of their favorite dishes.
I am completely obsessed with Washington's Chef Hercules. And I talk about him in my book. And of course, there's been a recent book coming out, The General's Cook, that came out, I think, last year by a good friend of mine. And his story to me is just, it's an all-American story in some cases, and it's also a tragic story in others. But, I consider him to be the first celebrity chef in America, because he is the first president's chef. If you think about any president, and their chef is going to be the most famous chef, especially in the 1790s in Philadelphia. And I think about, Chef Hercules was purchased by George Washington when he was about 16, and he sort of worked his way up into the kitchen at Mount Vernon. And then when Washington went to Philadelphia when he was the president and brought Hercules with him, he learned the trade of sort of, big scale cooking in that head chef position very fast in Philadelphia, and became a local superstar. I mean, there's an account of him walking down Market Street and getting bowed to by white people on the street. I mean, his outfit that is described by George Washington's step grandson is phenomenal. The guy had, silk stockings, blue velvet coat, a big hat, a watch, and a cane, and he would just strut down the street, and people just respected him more than any enslaved person could have ever imagined. The long story short is he was having to go back and forth from Philadelphia to Virginia because of the Gradual Emancipation Act that was put into place in Philadelphia, or Pennsylvania rather, that said that if you were an enslaved person over 6 months, you would be free automatically. Washington moved his group of enslaved people to Pennsylvania, not knowing that, funny enough, found out, and then would make sure his enslaved staff would go back to Virginia to make sure they stayed enslaved. During the 5 years that Chef Hercules went back and forth, I guarantee that he met whoever it was that helped him eventually escape on George Washington's birthday years later. So it's one of those things where, I think his story is so grand. I would have loved, I mean, if I could go back in time, I would go to that kitchen and I would, sit and talk with him, and I would go eat one of those meals with George Washington cooked by Chef Hercules. But, for me, his story is tragic in a sense that he had to, be enslaved the majority of his life. And, he had to escape and leave his family because they were all there stuck in bondage, and he found a way to leave and end up in New York. So for me, that's my sort of chef hero. That, and the person that we don't know her name, she's on the cover of my book. She's that enslaved cook that was pictured earlier. And I think that she really represents the countless enslaved cooks that we don't know their name, we don't have their stories, but they nonetheless helped, build this country and sustain a nation.
Wow. So if you ever did have an opportunity to go back and meet with Chef Hercules, what is the first question you'd ask him?
Oh, goodness. Do you like your job? And that sounds weird, but this guy's story is just fascinating to me. He used his position as Washington's chef to ultimately escape slavery and to become someone who was incredibly well known. So I would like to know if he liked to actually cook. Did he do it just to get out? What was the hustle behind that? I think that's something that I would really like to know. And sorry, my dog just barked. Yeah.
Okay. So,
Oops, hang on one second. Sorry, I clicked the wrong one. I had a question for you. Mary Wadlin wanted to know, and by the way, dogs barking is totally acceptable in the show.
Okay.
Mary Wadlin had a good question. She said, did they bring in European chefs to train the enslaved staff?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So Hercules was actually trained by a tavern keeper who was half Black. So he'd already, I'm blanking on his name right now, Samuel, it's right there. But he was trained by an African-American tavern keeper who was very well known in New York City. And of course, James Hemings, a lot of us know the story, but he went with, this is Jefferson's chef, went with Jefferson to France, to Paris, and learned the art of French cooking, which also helped eventually emancipate him. He had a tragic ending to his life, but he was formally trained in Paris by the best of the best. So it was a mix between sort of homegrown cooking by the mistress or even by other African folks and African Americans.
Good question, Mary. So the book also has some stories in it. Some are touching, some are fascinating, some are humorous. Give the audience a glimpse into one of those stories that's maybe your favorite.
Oh my goodness. I like a story about a man named Emmanuel, who he was the chef at Flower Dew 100 in the 19th century. And he was born into slavery at Flower. I'm trying to remember where Flower Dew was. It was in Prince George County. So it was sort of south of Jamestown, over in that way. And, Emmanuel was pretty much, the cook on the plantation. And when emancipation came, he had a reputation already in the area of having biscuits so good. It was like sort of God sent them down. He was a magician, right? He was known as the biscuit magician. And he found himself as an entrepreneur after enslavement and ended up leaving his former plantation and ended up buying land in Petersburg. And he was able to sort of break out of the sharecropping trap that a lot of newly freed folks were stuck in, and really be able to sort of turn his life into something that was, he could be proud of and excited about.
Wow. So in your estimation, in your research, would any of those chefs achieve the status of like Gordon Ramsay or any of the other Michelin chefs?
Yes, absolutely. And I, especially thinking about James Hemings and Chef Hercules. I mean, these were people who cooked for the most elite in the colony, the most elite in the early, nation. I can't think if you think about it, George Washington himself is going to have one chef. It's going to be Chef Hercules. Thomas Jefferson, who is really, one of the earliest foodies, if you will, in America, had an enslaved man as his chef. So that says something about their skill set. I mean, Jefferson could have paid for someone to come over. Of course, he had slaves. And so that's sort of where he pivoted for his workload. But if you think about the ways in which they were trained, the ways in which they put on these dinners for heads of states from all over the world, Hercules sold his leftovers out of the back door for hundreds of dollars a year. And back in, the 1790s, that's a lot of money. So yeah. I think they absolutely could compete, hands down.
Wow. Yeah, you're probably right. I wouldn't know, but if, somebody magic with the biscuits. I love biscuits, so I'm sure that could have worked out really well. So, what should the readers come away with after reading your book? What's the takeaway, the message?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I think it's important to attribute a lot of what we consider as American food to the enslaved folks who cooked it, to really think about credit critically, to think about the ways in which these foodways came from a system of bondage, of forced labor, but that this beautiful culinary history and legacy came out of such a dark part of our history. And to give credit to those who cook the food and who continue to cook the food, and to really sort of recognize their contributions to American cuisine.
Yeah, and in general influenced our way of life.
Absolutely.
The kitchen was the hub, it remained the hub, and it still is the hub. And in our lives, whether it's from a dark past, but it's all evolved together. We wouldn't be here if not for our rich history and people like yourself who bring it out in a very positive way. I had no idea that Southern hospitality got its roots from Senegal, but who knew?
Now we do.
Only a young archaeologist.
Not a paleontologist. They don't know anything
about
that. Not
a paleontologist, yeah.
They can deal with dead whales.
Any more questions from the audience, Susan?
No, but we did have Lucille wanted you to know that Lucille's mom is from Montrose, Virginia, which is, I believe, the home of Stratford Hall. And Lucille said that she was a Hutt, Hutt. And
okay.
That must mean something. I'm not sure what it means. I'm a Northerner.
I know the name.
Awesome. Yeah. So anyway, but that was it. But you have a lot of people hanging on for a wonderful conversation and such an interesting book. I definitely want to pick up a copy of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelley.
So much.
You've been a delightful guest, and we enjoyed having you on. So what's next? Are you going to write another book, or?
Yeah, so actually, funny you ask. This weekend, I'm heading up to Washington, D.C. I am doing a great courses series on the history of sugar. So I will be recording a 10-lecture series on the history of sugar that overlaps somewhat with the work that I've already done with the book, etc. It's a culinary history in some ways, but it's very much tethered to the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the African diaspora, etc. And so that's going to be released on Audible this summer, and you'll hear my voice. So
fabulous. We look forward to it.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Great. Well, all good luck to you, and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah.
Sounds great. Thank you.
All right, Kelley.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks for coming on.
Bye.
Mm-hmm. And Ralph, were you going to talk about your upcoming show?
Yes. And in 2 weeks, we have Robert Tecklenburg, who wrote an espionage thriller based in Eastern European, brings up recollections of John LeClaire. Terrific subject, fast-paced, and we'll have him on to discuss how he developed the premise and wrote the book.
Excellent. Well, we'll be sure to tune in back here in 2 weeks, and so that would be the 15th, right? Yes, June 15th. So
June 15th,
we'll see you then, Ralph.
It.
Great show tonight. Thank you so much to the viewers. Thank you so much for playing. I want to thank everybody for tuning in for another great edition of Reading, Writing, and Ralph. We are on hiatus tomorrow night, but we'll be back Thursday night on ZTV Live with our Elisa Kovac of Alexandria Makers Market, and she'll have her show with Make It Alexandria, highlighting clover and maple, a great maker right here in Alexandria. So tune in Thursday night at 7. Hopefully we'll see you then. And until then, remember to be the good news in someone's life.